you know, I was too young, but I have a lot of older relatives. Uncles that told me a lot of it.
Well, you know, when I was doing research of this many, many years ago, it's amazing how many men I talked to that didn't know a thing, but they heard the story.
Oh, well, you know what? I always heard that the places were run so well that the town fathers left them alone. Back to the problem.
There's a little of that. I'm glad your cake's good seeing you.
We have not seen a crowd like this for years.
We've got a lot of old Lynchburgers.
Yes, indeed. Established Lynchburg is here, not no Lynchburg. So, I want to welcome you all to the Jones Memorial Library, your library for local history and genealogy. My name is Jerry Shareko. I'm the Vice President of the Jones. I'm here to introduce our Executive Director, Deb Smith, who then will introduce our speaker. Before I do that, I want to encourage you all to come to the Jones to do research on your family's history and any local history projects, and many of you have, I know. The long-standing staff here, Chuck Bradner, Nancy Weiland, Kim Woodford, are the experts in local history. And our collection, already large, continues to grow, and that's a good thing. And speaking of the collection, if you have materials that you think might be useful to the Jones, please speak with Deb and the other staff members about what you might have to donate. Now, we don't take everything, and we don't need 14 copies of any given thing. In the past, that's kind of what we did. But what we do have, when we have extra copies, we would like to give those to you. So if anyone is interested in old EC Glass yearbooks, The Crescent, the Glass Literary Magazine, The Critic, we have an awful lot from the teens and 20s, the last teens and 20s. City directories, copies of the fantastic magazine, and this is for established Lynchburg, The Iron Worker. We have plenty of extra copies. We are not giving away our core. We have many in the archive, but we have many extra ones. So if people are interested, let us know. We also have books for sale. I'm so glad that Jim Ellison's book is on the cart back there. It is a wonderful book. I just bought two for two of my colleagues over at Randolph College where I work. So please consider purchasing that. Now on to what I'm supposed to be doing up here, and that's introducing Deb Smith. Deborah Smith received her BA in Anthropology from Oberlin College, her MA in Performance Studies from New York University, and her Master's of Library Information Science from Kent State University. Having a great deal of library and archival experience throughout her career, most recently, she served as the Executive Director of the Essex Library Association in Essex, Connecticut. We are so pleased that Deb came on board starting at the very end of August. She has great plans for the library, and the board is very excited about the future. Deb will now introduce our speaker, Nancy Jamerson Weiland. So Deb, please.
Thank you so much, Jerry, and welcome, welcome. It's great to see everybody here. And I want to give a special shout out to Carolyn, Jerry's wife, because she was the interim director before I joined, and she has left this library in wonderful shape. So it has been a pleasure to come in and to work with very talented staff and a very talented board. So great to see everybody here tonight. I've only been here a short time, so I did my interview back in, I think it was June, and I came down, I sort of had a first interview maybe in April, and then another interview in June. I came down, and so it was sort of, to see, did I like Lynchburg, how did I like the library? And by the way, I've been up in Connecticut, but I grew up in Richmond, so just 2 hours away, and I go to see family there all the time. So I feel like I'm back home here in Virginia. But I got to meet the staff, and I wanted to know, what was it about the Jones that attracted them to give their time and their talent to this marvelous institution? And so we were sitting around the table, and I remember Nancy, her response was just right on the point. I was sort of like, why the Jones? Why do you like history? And she was like, hookers. Woo! What kind of a library is this? But it was wonderful. And as I've gotten to know Nancy more, you know, she has this inimitable style and just this wonderful presence. And I know it's going to be a treat to have her speaking with us tonight. So I do want to tell you a little bit about Nancy. So she gave tours at the Old City Cemetery, where she portrayed 19th century Madame Lizzie Langley. And as some of you may know, she's a resident of the Garland Hill Historic District, where she's also former president of the Garland Hill Neighborhood Association. And she has long been involved in local historic preservation and civic activities. She has served on the Community Development Advisory Committee, the Advisory Council to the Lynchburg Area Housing Coalition, and as a member of the Board of Historic and Architectural Review. She's also the author of The History of Pamplin, Virginia, and we have copies of that publication here at the back if you'd like to pick one up to take one home tonight. And she has written several articles that have appeared in Lynch's, Ferry, and Central Virginia Life. She began her research on the Bawdy ladies back in 1982. So what is that? That's about 40 years of research. So we have a lot of expertise here. And she has been a guest speaker on the topic to several area organizations. And I'm delighted to hand the podium over now to Nancy so we can learn about just a few, I think, of the more than 500 women that she has researched. So thank you, Nancy.
I will note that I have a dress on that has cats on it. That's because we're going to be talking about cat houses. I thought this was the appropriate thing to wear for the program tonight. And let me work my way around here. And the interesting thing over the years is I've run across things. You know, we're talking about cat houses, bawdy houses, bordellos, brothels, disorderly houses, sporting houses, house of assignation, house of ill fame, you name it, they could come up with all sorts of names. Like Deb said, and by the way, we're so pleased to have Deb here. And today I'm going to introduce you to some of the ladies and tell you a little bit about the red light district of Lynchburg. This is one of Lynchburg's best kept secrets that everybody knew. Back in 1982-ish is when I decided I wanted to do something literary. I wanted to write the great American novel. So I thought, what can I write about? And at that time I was a cashier at Blue Auto Parts. And I mentioned that I was looking for something to write about. And several of the older gentlemen came in and says, well, why don't you write about 4th Street? I thought, what? 4th Street, you know, I'm a little girl from the country. I didn't know 4th Street or anything, so he told me about it. And I thought, well, that sounds intriguing. I think I'll start doing some research. I didn't know 40 years later I'd still be doing research. Lot to learn. And one of the things he told me was that there was one of the madams that still lived. She was at the City Nursing Home. And so I thought, well, I'll go over and talk to her and see if I can't get a little feel for what's what. And I had done a little bit of research. Now, when I started this project, I thought I was talking about the 1930s, 40s, maybe the 20s. I didn't know I was going to go all the way back to 1805. So I asked Doris, I said, told her who it was and what I was doing, and I said, maybe you could tell me something about your neighbors. I know they operated houses. She looked at me straight on and said, I don't know about that, but I'll tell you how I ran my house. And so for the rest of her life, which was 3 years before she passed, she told me a lot. She gave me a different point of view. Needless to say, the men I interviewed had a different point of view. Before the Civil War, and the early part, like I say, that started in 1805, we're talking about down on the riverfront, and it was called Buzzard Roost, and we're not real sure why. the name was Buzzard Roost, maybe because of the obvious. But at that time, it was not part of the city until 1829. And so it really didn't have a lot of policing. And so things were just kind of wild down there. It's like the old Wild West days. And one of the early, now I'm going to show my age. One of the early sketches that was entitled Lynchburg in the 50s, and he was talking about the 1850s. It was written by John Cabell Early. It said, Buzzard Roost on Jefferson Street was thronged with the most rowdy and disreputable class of fallen women and tough men, the latter mostly the crews of freight boats. Several murders took place in this locality, and the police had much trouble keeping the inhabitants in order. On more than one occasion, even in broad open daylight, there were so many engaged in free fight that the police could not cope with them in the usual means and had to get the hose, and the firemen would drench the belligerents who without a door thus cool might be seen lying about in the street like a lot of drowned bees. And so that was throughout that, and then in 1867, there was a newspaper account of trying to control the activities on Buzzard Street. And it read, for the better preservation of the public peace and for the purpose of preventing any disorderly conduct on the part of enlisted men, all houses of ill fame in the 3 disreputable localities known as Buzzard Roost, 10 Shingles, and Curls Row will be vacated by the present occupants in order to leave the premises within 10 days. Well, there was a woman named Eliza McDaniel, and evidently she didn't want to pay any attention to it. And in a news account, it said that Eliza McDaniel and several female boarders were driven out of Buzzard Roost. Eliza and the girls lived in a frame shanty in Sandy Hook, which is a bar of land between the canal and the river. Some of the residents of the area were determined that no such characters would remain in their midst. On Wednesday night, a party of some 10 or dozen so men went to the house where the women lived, which were situated immediately on the bank of the river, and they toppled both the house and the inmates into the stream. They went down beautifully, it was said, and the fun was glorious. None of the women were worse for the washing and scrambled out of the water. They made tracks at a double quick from the localities which was too hot to hold them, amid the jeers of those who introduced them to an involuntary but much needed bath. The shady ladies of Buzzard did return to business and flourished along the river until the 1900s. In the early 1900s, around between then and 1910, as the residents moved out and businesses moved in, they started to migrate over towards the city cemetery in that section of 4th Street, Jackson, Monroe, which that area eventually became known as the Hill. After the talk, if you want to come up and look, these houses that are marked in yellow, this is Buzzard Roost before 1900, and over here shows the Hill, which was between 1880 and 1910. And the Hill, of course, got its name from Thrill Hollow. And how many of you are familiar with Thrill Hollow? You know? Well, I figured, okay. I even knew about that down in Pamplin. When I was in high school, we used to come to Lynchburg and ride down Thrill Hollow. I didn't know about the houses then. I didn't know this was going to end up being what I'd end up doing. The first court record, like I said, was of Isabella Kidd in 1807 for running a house of ill fame. She was charged with a breach of peace. It was not until 1853 that we see a count of anybody being charged with a crime. So there was a little lag in there. I've found a lot of my research through city directories, census records, court records, and one of the things that I've always made it a rule when I give this talk is the information is all public record. Now, I was telling you about Doris that I met, and she did tell me some stories, but she told me she couldn't tell me tales and names too. She would kind of keep that a secret. As the years have gone by, like I said, I started doing this over 20 years ago. When I first started giving this talk, I'd say, who'd heard of 4th Street? And everybody seemed to have heard about it. And I especially like that as I talked, the older gentleman in the crowd would be sitting there going, you know, like that. And I go, know where you've been, or you know. That was the interesting thing. I interviewed probably over 100, 150 different men. And they all pretty much said the same thing. They never went down there. They didn't know personally, but they'd heard stories. I'll give you some figures here so you'll know a little bit of how this thing went. And one madam lived on 4th Street in 1881. There were 4 in 1883. Between 1907 and 1910, there were 30. Jackson Street had 2 in 1892, and between 1900 and 1912, the number increased to 13. Monroe Street saw an increase from 1 in 1880 to 2 to 1897, to between 1900 and 1912, there were 14. There were 8 houses on Monroe Street, 7 houses on Jackson Street, and 16 houses on 4th Street. So we had 31 houses over there. These figures represent between 1890 and 1910. During World War II, the district was reduced to 8 houses on 4th Street, 3 on Monroe, and by the early 1950s, there were only 3, and the last house was shut down in 1964. And that belonged to the infamous Tootsie Clay. And by this time, Tootsie was aged, and everywhere she went, she had to take a shoebox full of medications. So when they closed her house, they decided the best thing to do was just ship her off to Florida. So Tootsie moved to Florida. There's a news article in 1946. Now, before I get to that, I will mention at one point, we had busloads of soldiers coming up from Camp Pickett. And when they came, they were not allowed to be on 4th Street in the red light district in uniform. So they would stop by the Army-Navy store, leave their uniform, and rent civilian clothes. So they could go down to 4th Street. Well, in 1946, it seems that there were 23 exposures leading to venereal disease among the soldiers and sailors that took place in the hotels. This was not in the district, this was in the hotels. There was an increase from 14 cases in 1944. To combat the spread, the Social Hygiene Council suggested the following steps. Pay bellboys $2 for each report of prostitute operating in a hotel, $1 for a report of any male guest asking for a prostitute, and $5 for information leading to the arrest and conviction of an employee acting as a procurer. And in my interviews, one of the people I interviewed was Chauncey Spencer. And, you know, he was a doll. Absolutely loved Chauncey. Chauncey was a bellboy at one of the hotels. And he told me there were more than once that his people would, you know, the people wanted to know where they could get a lady in the evening. And Chauncey would help them out with that. So I wonder if he made any money from during this time on that. They also changed the house detective to house officers' attire, giving them uniforms, thus deterring the effort upon the prostitute seeking to enter the hotel for her own purposes. close all lobbies before 11 a.m., demand sufficient identification of a bag of a guest who wished to register himself and wife. We had to prove it was and wife. And check the room of unescorted women for unusually large numbers of incoming and outgoing calls from male guests. The Bawdy ladies of the pre-1910 era were most likely from the area, and once they established their business, they tend to maintain it until their death. These women tended to be women of widows or single mothers. Records are not always clear on how many of these women have small children as a result of birth out of wedlock. A large majority of the prostitutes came from the working class. Many young women felt they were ruined by their first sexual contact or were locked out of the family home for sexual transgressions. Many women during the early years of the 20th century also slipped in and out of prostitution as economics needed was required. A vast majority of the women entered the profession more or less voluntarily, viewing the trade as an easier, more lucrative way of survival, as jobs were just not available to women during this time. You're talking, Victorian times through the early 1900s. A woman of ambition would enter the profession with the aim of becoming madam. To reach the position of madam or landlady was a progression of starting out as a girl and working you up. The madam would be the one not only to oversee the operation, but obtain the lion's share of the profits. The best sporting houses would have a staff of maid, housekeepers, cooks, piano player to entertain in the parlor. This was true of the houses on the hill during the 30s and 40s. The house price would range from $5 to $20, which would be most frequently to the wealthy men. These men often used the facilities as a clubhouse, where they would meet to play a game of cards and a drink. The better houses would be finely furnished with women dressed in fashion, the latest fashion, and they would maintain hours usually around 7 until starting at 7 p.m. Next in class would be the shanty houses that would consist of only 2 or 3 rooms, and sometimes they would take a room and just divide it up into cribs to where it would just be a bed and a washstand to get as many rooms as possible out of a small thing. Everybody who's familiar with 4th Street is familiar with the names Louise and Bernice. Louise and Bernice were half-sisters, and they were there during the 20s, 30s, and 40s. In fact, they left town in 1947 and went to New York. One of the things that they would do, Louise especially, she would offer what she would call a buy. The house would be closed to the public during the week, during the weekend, and the special buyout. And this usually was Mr. Wrigley, the chewing gum. He would rent Louise's house for the weekend and fly down a bunch of his buddies, and they would spend the weekend here in Lynchburg at Louise's house. And that was not uncommon, not just for somebody famous like him, but a lot of corporate people, because Louise and Bernice were world known. I've heard stories of soldiers during World War II being in the trenches in Europe, and somebody said, well, where are you from? I said, well, I'm from Lynchburg. Oh, you know Louise and Bernice? Say hi to Louise when you get back. Some of the ladies down there, the early ladies, that I talked about at the city cemetery a lot was the Langleys. And the Langleys were free blacks born in Amelia County. That was a mother-daughter relationship there, and that was not uncommon to have mother-daughters in the business. And in June of 1860, Agnes was listed as a person of ill fame with a personal estate of $150. And Lizzie was also listed as ill-famed with a personal estate of $5,000, which is about $92,000 today. And in 1848, Lizzie bought a lot on 10th Street, and she paid $1,100, which is about $20,000 today. And the thing I always impressed me about the Langleys was Agnes in 1861 married Pleasant Adams, who was a free man of color. And before she would agree to marry him, she made him sign a marital contract. And during the contract, it was agreed that he would have no right, title, or interest to any estate, property, real or personal, that Agnes had acquired. All property granted to her daughter, Lizzie Langley. Agnes could not read or write, but she could sign a prenup. So, by 1870, we don't see Pleasant anymore, so either he's gone or has passed on. One of the other madams that was on downtown in, 1864. She was born in 1864, died in 1918. And the news article about her said, Queen of Africa, in again. Last night, Carrie Wilson, alias Queen of Africa, was locked up together with Mary Rose, another colored woman, by Detective Irving and Officer Howell, charged with loitering on the street. The Queen of Africa was released from jail just the other day, and hardly a week passed without her being arrested. Last night she was paraded up and down Main Street, dressed in a blue velvet dress with a wide split, and the plume of her hat so large it was difficult for patrons to pass. Part of my cemetery tour is Ella and Nora Jamerson. Yep, 1/2 third cousins they are. They were. They lived in Appomattox County, where I'm from. And Ella, the oldest one, came to Lynchburg, and she was born in 1866. She came to Lynchburg in the 1880s and went to work at one of the houses. And then in 1892, Nora, her 15-year-old sister, came and joined her. In July of 1894, Nora took an overdose of laudanum, which was a preferred method of suicide among prostitutes during that time frame. So many of them really had a hard time with the life that either they had chosen or that they were thrown into. And so they tended to overdose on laudanum. And the newspaper account reads that she'd been drinking some that night, was in good spirits. She died between 2 and 3 in the morning, never given a reason for her act. The funeral of Nora was held at the house on Commerce Street. According to the funeral notice, present were about 24 women, most of them from the section of the city. In the remarks of the pastor made, he addressed the living. The number of the women present showed great emotion, and 8 or 10 of them expressed the desire to lead better lives. The scene made a deep impression on all who witnessed it. The death of Nora obviously affected her sister Ella quite a bit, and Ella committed suicide by throwing herself in the James River in 1897. And the newspaper account mentioned her sister Nora, and it said, who was also without character and ended a miserable life some 2 or 3 years ago by swallowing laudanum. The only mourner was Ella's father, who walked all the way from Appomattox to see the last of his wayward daughter. For nearly 160 years, conservative Lynchburg played host to some of the most well-known brothels in the country. Thanks to a number of printed sources, we're able to piece together the lives of the Bawdy ladies of Lynchburg. They also left undocumented stories and oral history, like bell waddling and Gone with the Wind. Ladies always rose to the cause. When allowed, they funneled their money through faithful friends to see that hospitals, orphanages, playgrounds, and art centers had the necessary funds to be built. Without their generosity, many of the facilities either would not exist or at best not exist in the manner they do. Whatever your opinion may be of the profession, keep in mind the old cliche, the prostitute, the heart of gold, was often true. Many of the girls moved on with their lives, married, and had families. Neither they or their loved ones ever looked back. And that was one of the interesting things in talking to Doris. I got the perspective of the girls on that. And now most of them didn't choose this life. That didn't something they really wanted to do, but through economics or whatever reason, they were thrust into it. But these girls, especially the ones through the 30s and 40s and stuff, they took care of each other. Louise made each girl open a bank account and send money home to the family. And there were a number of occasions where I know of one church that needed a new furnace, and they didn't have the funds to do it. And the 4th Street madams offered to pay for the furnace, and they wouldn't let them because of, you know, their background. So they kind of went around Robin Hood's barn, and they gave the money to some of the church members, and the furnace got made. And I had, it was one man that worked for an appliance company, and they, one of the girls bought a new refrigerator, and it was paid for in $5 bills. So it's been quite a journey for 40 years to unearthing this part of Lynchburg history that, like I say, it's Lynchburg's best kept secret that everybody knew. I was surprised at how many people knew about it, and I, wasn't one that did. But it was, it's one of those things that you kind of wonder how it all worked. And it was back in the days of the good old boy network. So everybody knew everybody. And the doctors and the lawyers and the judges that knew these women, they met them as teenagers. So they had a relationship with these girls before they ever found prominence in their career. So, it was like they couldn't very well throw their old friend in jail. So they kind of looked the other way on that. But that's what I know for so far. And as I learn more things all the time, people are forever telling me new stories. And I have more and more stories that I could sit here all night, but we don't have all night. So therefore, if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Yes?
Why did the garden club ladies put up with it?
The garden club ladies?
The church ladies, the respectable ladies.
Put up with the, well, I had one person tell me, a quite elderly lady, she was like in her 90s. And when I was talking to her about the girls on 4th Street, and her comment was, well, after I had my kids, I was done. That was it. I was happy for John to go down there.
Nobody else can service
So, we're talking about a different time. We're talking about Victorian era and time before birth control. And so they just, it's easier to turn the head. Any other questions?
You didn't mention Frida. What happened to Frida?
I don't know what happened to
There were
Frida.
3 of them.
There were
Louise,
three.
Bernice, and Frida.
I don't know what happened to Frida.
Is that name familiar to you?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember the name Frida, but I don't know what happened to her. I know Louise and Bernice left in 1947 and went to New York.
Now, Louise had a child that lived in Philadelphia,
That's right.
and she would never tell that child what she was doing in Lynchburg. She sent that child over to Philadelphia when the child was little. She told the child she ran a school for young women. And the child didn't know that until she was grown. And then the tree didn't, then the apple didn't fall far from the tree with the daughter.
How about that? Well, I know Tootsie also had a son that it was raised by one of her relatives, and he ended up being a brigadier general in the army.
Well, Louise was a lady.
Louise was, I've always heard that. She was very much a lady. She was of mixed race, a very light skin, and that she always wore pearls, and she always dressed. And that was the thing, all of the houses, the women tended to dress in evening gowns, nice clothes, downstairs, changed upstairs. And the good houses like Louise and Bernice, when you got into the shanty kind of houses, you know, they're the ones that tended to wear the clothes that most people think of, the ladies run around in the underwear kind of thing. And they bought the underwear in Vogue. That was one of the places they would go shopping. They would go into Vogue, and you know, of course, everybody was, I'll wait on them, get it. And I've heard one story of Tootsie had a mink coat, and she went into Vogue, and she took her mink coat and went, and walked through the store with dragging her mink coat to get lingerie for her girls. Yes, sir.
How dangerous was it for these women, and did the police give them any protection, or did they have bouncers in their houses, or what?
They did have bouncers in the houses, and I'm saying part of it goes back to the good old boy network. Everybody kind of knew everybody. Now, unless you count the fact that Pretty Boy Floyd used to come to town and go to Bernice's house. So there was a few shady characters there. I've never been told exactly if there was a payoff or if there wasn't not. I was kind of led to believe, like, you know, that there was kind of an alert system. The police department needed to give raids. They had to answer to the public for this, you know, what was going on down on 4th Street. But they kind of got an advance phone call saying, you know, we're raiding tomorrow night at Red. And it was one house, Mamie Fimster, she had 2005, 2007 houses side by side with the breezeway. And when they would raid this house, everybody would run through the breezeway and out the back door of the other house. Anything else? Yes. Yes.
Did you find out the names of the doctors who looked after
did
these
it
women?
cost?
How much did it cost her?
Yeah, per,
$5 service, yeah, per service, $5 to $20, depending on the house, and
second,
yeah, $5 up to $20. And your question was,
Did you find out the names of the doctors who looked after these women?
yes, I did.
Well, those houses were handled on a very business type.
They were. It was a business.
Louise looked after her girls, saw to it they were regularly checked against venereal disease.
Not only that,
So,
yeah.
and they ran those houses so carefully and so clean that the town fathers left them alone.
The health department actually came to the houses on a regular basis and would inspect the house and inspect things. And I remember Doris telling me that one time the health inspector came, and of course they served drinks and stuff, and as the guys were playing cards and whatnot, and they said, you know, I think it would be more hygienic if you use paper cups instead of glasses. And Doris's comment was, This is a whorehouse, and they're worried about paper cups and glasses. And one of the back in when Monopoly was invented, and you know that was all the rage, and everybody. And there was a group of men that used to go down to Louise's and to play Monopoly. And that's really what they were doing, was playing Monopoly. And one of the guys told me, he said, if that house had been raided while we were down there, that they never would have believed we were just there playing Monopoly. But that's what they were doing. Okay, anything? Yes, ma'am.
What brought it into things?
In 1954, Mamie Height and one of the girls was murdered by one of the other girls. And by that time, we were down to Mamie's house, Tootsie's house, and Doris's house. Everybody else had just gradually moved away as times changed, you know. And then after Mamie's murder, that just left Tootsie and Doris. And Tootsie, they closed her down in '64. And Doris, she quit about, I think she said after they closed Tootsie, she just quit. She said she'd have one or two girls for a little while. But it was just one of those things, as times changed, it changed. And it faded out. As well as, the way Doris talked about it was she felt like the end had a lot to do with the fact that morals changed. You know, back then, nice girls didn't. And as times went on, nice girls did. So the need, you know, wasn't there. And as well as, you know, it was just time. Yeah. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit more about the economics of running a whorehouse? So were the madams actually wealthy? I know you mentioned the Langleys had some malls in Lynchburg, but was that a way that a woman could?
That's the way a woman gained wealth, is you know, if that was going to be her profession, then she wanted to be a madam, because the madam got the lion's share of the money. You know, the girls got a portion. It depended from house to house how the economics went. Some of it was a 50-50 split. Some of it was bigger, or, you know, it varied from house to house. But the madam was the one that made the money. And the madam did not take care of the customers. They were always taken care of by the girls, unless it was a special.
There was $20.
That's the $20. You got that one. That's right. And that's the $20 special.
I understand that from time to time, college students would come, and some of them didn't have any money. And Louise would lend them money, but Louise insisted that she have some collateral. Well, when she died, they found a drawer full of college school rings.
Yes, and wallets. Yeah, and wallets. Yep. That's true.
I'm not going to mention the name, but there are 4 or 5 colleges that were frequented,
Pretty quick. And also,
especially right after the war.
yeah, and some of the college boys would come down and hire one of the girls as their prom date. So that they could show off to the guys what they do. So yeah, the colleges definitely help finance 4th Street. Yes, sir.
What was the average age?
Average age of the girls? From as young as 15 to about 25 or so. Usually they were in their teens or early 20s if they were in the profession as a necessity. And you know, if something had happened, if they, their transgression, or either they had to make money, they would do that, but they would use it only until they could get enough money. Back to Louise taking care of her girls. Louise had one girl that was just, she was taking care of her mother and her father and several of her siblings. and she wanted to be a seamstress, which reminds me, I'll go back to that in a minute. She wanted to be a seamstress, and she was really good at making clothes and stuff. And Louise gave her the money to buy a sewing machine so she could get out of the business and started. Seamstress is a euphemism that is often used in the census records as well as the city directories. The fun part of the research was figuring out who is a seamstress and who is really not a seamstress. As they were listed as madam. Now, one of the ways I was able to identify them is they were listed as madam up until 1912 in the city directory. And in the 1860 census, they were all listed as prostitute or ill fame. So, yes?
Now, did the madams furnish food for the girls, or did the girls have to?
The madam, she furnished foods, but the girls had to do their own laundry and, you know, buy their own clothes, but she furnished the food.
Was abortion, something that came up?
It did, and of course, back in those days, a number of the girls lost their lives because of that.
Gotta keep in mind, back in those old days, there weren't very many professions for ladies.
Exactly.
And teach school, you could be a secretary maybe in a limited way.
Right.
Or you could hire yourself out, as these young women did, until a lot of them got married. Right out of the
A lot of them got
house.
married, and a lot of them met their husbands
I know
there.
when
I
I was
know
growing
who
up,
you're
I knew
talking
some men that married them. But the ladies were attractive.
Yeah, and the one person I think you're thinking about, and I'm thinking about too, her husband is extremely prominent.
Yes.
It was, I mean, he was prominent in the city government, in the city itself, and that was one of those things that I found interesting. Everybody knew that she was one of Louise's girls, but nobody cared. She left her profession, she married him, they adopted 2 children, and she was a hard worker in the church, and all the church members just embraced her, and just never, you know, it never was an issue what her background was. So. Yes?
Were the houses of Bawdy men?
Were
there any Bawdy men?
Probably, I would not be surprised. In one of the census records, in the midst of all of these ladies that are listed as prostitutes, there's one guy in there is listed as a sportsman. And I assume that's probably what he was. A lot of these women had what they call fancy man. It wasn't really a pimp, but it was their boyfriend. And sometimes it was a pimp, sometimes it wasn't. Very rarely did they actually have pimps. Yes?
What type of city was Lynchburg overall then? I guess this is more of Devil's Hot Seat and less of city churches.
I'm sorry.
So when did Lynchburg transition to be less of like city of churches? Sorry. It seems like more of Devil's Hot Seat.
Oh, Lynchburg has always been the city of churches. Actually, if you go back in time, there was at one point though, before it got, this is like, can't remember, seat of Satan's kingdom, Chuck. Do you remember the year on that one? It was 18, yeah, that was way back in the 1820s. At one point, Lynchburg was known as the seat of Satan's kingdom.
Have you published your information?
Some of it is in some articles I've written for Lynch's Ferry magazine. Yes?
I was just wondering, were other cities in Lynchburg, I mean, you say Lynchburg was known as, what was the seat of Satan?
Kingdom, yeah.
So were there other cities in?
Lynchburg is not, no. As far as the red light districts and how it's operated and everything, no, Lynchburg was not unique at all. If you go back in history in New Orleans, there was a section called Storyville that got to be quite famous. And Lynchburg was actually no different. The only thing I think it made Lynchburg different than Lynchburg is people just thought, Lynchburg? Nah, it couldn't be happening. Yes, ma'am.
When my mother got out of high school, she went straight to work for the gas company, and Tootsie Clay would come in to pay her gas bill, and she was always dressed to the nines. My mother had no idea who she was, and so she would, and none of the other women would take her money. And so Mom said and they always discussed clothing, and so at the dinner table one night, my mother mentioned that she had this great customer who was so nice and dressed and had all these beautiful clothes, and they talked about clothes in New York and all these things. And so my grandmother asked, well, who's that? And she said, well, her name is Tootsie Clay. And she said, my grandfather looked over his glasses at my grandmother and said, Trussie, you take care of this right now. She got my mother up from the dinner table, and they went on to the sleeping porch where my mother was told about Tootsie's profession. My mother, there was nothing she could do about it because she always came to her. She wasn't going to be rude to her.
Right.
But it was always, she said, Trussie, you take care of this now.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you all so much for coming. It still amazes me after 20 years, it still draws a crowd.
And I know if you'd like to speak with Nancy sort of one-on-one, please feel free to stay and do that. Our next lecture is going to be October 19th, right here again, and it's John D. Abel, who's going to talk about redlining in Lynchburg, the history and the lingering impacts of redlining. So hope you'll be able to join us then as well. Thank you.
Okay.